In the previous video, we set up iSCSI and connected to some targets. Those devices appear in the storage now, but we still haven't formatted them as VMFS. So just like we would need to do for local storage, because these are not already formatted, I'll need to format them. Now on my second server, if these are going to be shared, I wouldn't need to. I'll go back to data stores. I'm just going to click add storage, choose disk 1. My iSCSI disks appear. I'll just select it and put a standard VMFS on it. I'll just give it a simple name like iSCSI 01. Maximum available space is fine, and then we'll finish that. So now that we've got it formatted on the first server, we want it to be available on the second server as well. Now it's going to take a little time. If I check my tasks here, we can see it's still in progress. So what we'll need to do is duplicate this same configuration on the second server, and then I'll just click add storage, and those disks will appear, and I can just connect to them, and they're already going to be formatted. Or potentially I can just click rescan all. This would also be useful too. If we've added new disks in the storage infrastructure, this will rescan all the host bus adapters and or check them for VMFS volumes. If you don't want to rescan everything, you can go back to storage adapters and rescan a specific adapter as well if you like. If we take a look at that, I've got a few connected targets, a few connected devices, and quite a few paths, which is really the targets times the number of devices. If I close this taskbar here, we can see that I've got a couple of devices and then I've got the paths associated with them. They're marked as active. Now, depending on what's supported by our SAN, we may or may not really be able to do this. Now, it's certainly beneficial if we can. We want to have multipathing available so that we can both use the capacity of multiple storage paths simultaneously, and also that we have failover in the event of a problem. So if we right click in here, we can disable specific paths if we need to, although that's typically not what we're going to do. And if we go back to storage, there's a few things that we're going to see. So if I go to the properties of my data store, we'll see that we have an option for manage paths. Now we have a few different choices available here. We have fixed, in which case it will use the specific path that we list, unless it fails, in which case it'll choose another path. Round robin, which would actually do a fair amount of load balancing, but not as much as you might think, and also most recently used. Effectively, with most recently used and fixed, they're not exactly load balanced. So what we would typically do is configure different data stores to use different paths as their preferred path. And we can see it, we can just right click on it and say preferred. That way, what we're going to end up having to do potentially is on our storage infrastructure, let's say I've got 4 paths, maybe 4 LUNs, and then say I want you to use this path, and you to use this path, and you to use this path, and so on. Here, I really only have 2 paths that are originating locally, so we'll have to compare these and make sure we understand where they're actually going and what they're doing, but we can do this. Now, in theory, if we use round robin, the idea is that it will use multiple paths. It does not really. I mean, round robin implies we're going to use one path at a time, and we're just going to rotate between the paths. The idea is if we have a few data stores, by rotating them enough, then we should statistically load balance fairly well. That's not guaranteed to happen because our data stores are not necessarily evenly loaded. So that causes difficulties. And there's no great solution here. I mean, other than manually planning the paths and using fixed and preferred paths, we might be able to do that. However, if your SAN supports it, they may provide additional path selection policy modules to be able to support some other form of true load balancing based on load and not just based on after a certain amount of traffic rotating the path that you're using. Now, this is going to require specific support in your storage array and is going to require some specific path selection policy modules from your vendor. We're going to take a look in a second at how to go in and look at some of this detail. So we can do that at the data store level, and that's typically where we're going to do it. But if we go into the devices, we can see that we also have some of these options as well for a particular disk. I recommend that you've got one VMFS on one LUN. So we shouldn't really need to mess directly with the properties of the disks. If we have a data store that's made up of multiple different RAID sets or multiple raw disks coming out of something like a JBOD, just a bunch of disks type storage enclosure or something, then we might want to manage paths individually for the disk. But typically this is going to represent a virtual disk in our SAN that's already protected by RAID and everything else, and we only see the one disk. Although we can see that to VMware, it actually has multiple paths to this same disk. And the main point of the multipathing is to determine that that's really all the same disk, just available over a few different connections. And we can see that the owner of this disk is something called NMP, the native multipathing. And that would potentially be different if you were using some third-party multipathing provider. So I just want to show you a little bit of detail. I'm not going to go too far on this because it's a little complicated, but if you can imagine an environment with many, many, many data stores, it's going to become pretty awkward to go and always select the right properties for the data store, in terms of what multipathing options you want to use. Or even worse, if you're actually assigning preferred paths and things manually, then trying to keep that up to date and trying to determine which one you should use and so on is all a little tricky. From a capacity planning point of view, there's not really that much you can do. But if we have different arrays, for example, we might have some arrays that we're using, maybe we're migrating off of it, or maybe it's a test box or something like that. What we might find is that half of my data stores need to use maybe round robin or whatever supported by the SAN, using the native VMware round robin. And then other data stores that are being presented off some other array that does have some kind of native multipathing provider are going to have to be set up that way. So rather than manually setting this on the properties of each data store and hoping that no one goes in on the devices and does something that interferes or conflicts with that, what we can do is we can go over to the shell and we have ESXCLI. And when we run ESXCLI, we'll see that there are sections available for dealing with the storage. So I'm going to go ESXCLI storage. And you can see that we have some options available for the native multipath. We also have options available for the SAN and for VMFS and for the file system. So for example, I could use ESXCLI storage NMP. And you can see in this case, we have some available options for the path selection policy, for storage array types, for devices, for paths. And if we get into PSP, for example, we can list the different path selection plugins that are available so we could see if our vendor had provided something and if it was properly recognized in the shell. So those sorts of things we can do. So for most of the things that we're going to need to do, other than verifying, for example, whether the correct path selection policy is available, we may need to set up what are called claim rules to say, for example, that particular storage devices should always use a particular path selection plugin. So if we use ESXCLI storage core, you can see that inside core, we've got some options for claiming and for claim rule. So in this case, I'll just do basic example with claim rule. We can just do a list here as well, and we can see what's been set up for them. This is going to require very careful review and analysis and testing, but we can see that a Dell Universal Export Path rule has already been set up here to provide some specific options, in this case for a Dell. But using those types of properties, we can set up matching rules that say, if your vendor is this, or if the transport type is this, or if the model is something else, that we want to have it claim particular paths or use particular plugins and so on. So there's quite a bit that we can do here. And in a larger scale environment, you may need to go in and set some of these options. Take a look at the VMware SAN configuration guide. Take a look at what your vendor provides in terms of documentation. Pretty much every storage vendor now knows that they're going to need to interface with VMware. So you're also going to want to look at things like the VMware Advanced Array integration, things like the availability potentially of a non-native multipathing so that we can do better, more effective load balancing. You definitely want to take a look at how to optimize your environment for the particular storage that you're using. And different data stores may require different options because they're coming from different storage. There's other factors that go into this. There's also issues of things like HBAQ depths and so on. Those kind of details can be important as well, especially as you try to go to the high end, or if you're trying to reuse some old hardware that you have that has marginal compatibility with VMware, you may find that you're going to have quite a bit of difficulty in these kind of areas.